So Greg, a lot of challenges here right now when we look at the trade arena between Canada and the U.S. One of the big focuses, of course, is always going to be, and has been in the past, dairy.
Yep.
What are some of the changes that your organization is looking for headed into possibly a USMCA renegotiation?
Well, as the guy that was involved in negotiating these changes the first time around, I think the answer would be we need to get Canada to do what it agreed to do from the U.S. perspective during the negotiation. And, in terms of Class 7, we knew that they would move that around and find another place to stash that protein, and they have, and 4B or however they've done it. And we put some guardrails on that, at least for the first few years.
Yeah.
That is what it is. Canada's demand for butter continues to increase, and that's where it comes in on the second point of the equation, is in terms of how Canada is appropriating its tariff rate quotas and administering its tariff rate quotas. We're not satisfied with that. Well, I mean, there was the first trade case between the U.S. and Canada and USMCA was on this issue. We're not happy with that. We're going to continue to emphasize that this has to be looked at again and rediscussed government to government in order to get this right, because we think that Canada just hasn't done it the way, I know they haven't done it the way we intended it and what was discussed during the negotiation.
Have you been happy or satisfied with the handling of the skim milk proteins?
I'd have to go back and look and see within the last year or so where we're at on that. I think initially the answer would be yes, but they've, pardon the pun, but they've kind of moved the cheese a little bit on that as well in terms of how they're doing that. So I haven't dug into that lately to see where we are in the last year or so.
Now on the allocation of the TRQs, the tariff rate quotas, the USMCA dispute panel did rule in Canada's favor.
Yeah, technically.
Okay,
yeah.
so
it was kind of a split decision in my opinion, and looking at it, it wasn't clear cut. So again, I understand that.
Yeah.
The decision was and is what it is. But I certainly think from the U.S. perspective, we're not satisfied, and we want another look at this.
Going forward, do you see there being, what is the ask going forward from the U.S. dairy industry in your organization when you do talk to Secretary Rollins, or where you used to work at the USTR? Is it to find more market access in Canada, or is it to have Canada meet your definition in the U.S. of those TRQs?
Well, I think it's a negotiation. What is appropriate, and that's part of what Ambassador Lighthizer and President Trump wanted was, when we go back to NAFTA and think about this, when we negotiated the original NAFTA, the internet didn't even exist. So what we added was a digital trade agreement. We've added new bells and whistles. Now, 5 or 6 years later, there are new things that have developed in the dairy market between the U.S. and Canada. Let's go back and take a fresh look at this and look at and negotiate what's an appropriate way to go forward between, two of the biggest trading partners in agriculture in the world. There's no animus here. What's a fair deal?
Look at the rest of the world. What are the other big markets that the U.S. dairy industry is really looking to expand from an export perspective?
So I think from our perspective right now, you look at a couple areas in the world, and number one, obviously, for all of us is China. And the biggest challenge that we have in dairy is that Chinese demand for all agricultural commodities, and especially on the protein side of the equation, has gotten soft. It's not what it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
It's a function of how soft the Chinese economy is. And so what we've seen happen is, New Zealand, almost half of what they were producing was going into China in one form or another. Now that that's gotten soft, we have New Zealand product backing up into our markets here in the Western Hemisphere. Have you seen how much New Zealand butter is going into Mexico these days? This is a real challenge. And so, New Zealand's doing what it's doing because it has to export. It has no choice. And so how do you look at around the world with that softness in China, and how do we rejigger what we can from a dairy perspective and a U.S. agricultural perspective, given that Chinese softness? And the answer is, we see our opportunity continue to be Mexico. And on January 1 of this year is the first time now, because of CAFTA-DR that was negotiated, 15 years ago, we finally have a zero tariff for U.S. dairy in CAFTA and the Dominican Republic. And our market share in there, I'm not satisfied at all with our market. It's like 30%, a third, whatever it is, Shaun. It's terrible.
Yeah.
we need to go look at this as where is the ground that we can take and hold from a U.S. market share perspective, and that Central America is definitely on our radar from that perspective.
One of the things I want to wrap up with was I was at the Milk Business Conference that Farm Journal had back in December in Vegas, and talking to dairy producers and listening to the meeting there, so much concerned about some of the immigration policy of this administration. The dairy industry in the U.S., no secret, using a lot of undocumented labor, upwards of half across the country, maybe more. How do you reconcile this when you look at your membership?
Well, it's an enormous problem. And in fact, going back to my Aimpoint research days, before I took this job a year ago with dairy, what's the biggest problem in U.S. agriculture today? I would argue it's labor, and labor.
Yeah.
These are the issues. And from, H2A doesn't work for dairy because we need these folks year round. It's not a seasonal labor force. This has to be resolved. And you say, well, what percentage are legal or illegal? There's no way to know today. And so this is an enormous issue. But what I would close by saying, Shaun, is look at the U.S. dairy industry, though. $8 billion in new investment in processing and technology to grow the dairy industry in the U.S. Where else is that going on in any other commodity anywhere in the world? Enormous opportunity here in terms of dairy and in terms of producing protein and the solids in the dairy. The demand for that in the U.S. and globally just continues to grow in just a straight line. We are positioned really, really well for this. It's these kinds of issues in terms of labor and structural issues that we've got to continue to work on. And if we do, we've got great days ahead of us in the U.S. dairy industry.
Great stuff. Gregg, thanks a lot for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.